In this courtyard, there's an elementary school where children play every day, but underneath this courtyard is the traditional place where Jesus faced Pilate, a courtyard that John's Gospel tells us was called the stone pavement. So imagine being in a place like this where Jesus was facing Pilate, very much like this. In fact, they've used this site for movies. We're at the beginning of the Stations of the Cross that people will use to follow Jesus from his sentencing to his crucifixion in the city of Jerusalem. And as we move through the city, we'll be, in many cases, we'll be surrounded by people who are marking those stops. But on Good Friday especially, there's processions that lead thousands of people through the city. What I want you to catch while you're here is that when Jesus faces Pilate, Pilate is trying to provoke Jesus to admit that he's the king of the Jews, and Jesus says, well, whose idea was that? And then he finally says, well, my kingdom is not of this world. So in other words, you don't have to be afraid of me. And then Pilate says, then you are a king. He's trying to get Jesus to condemn himself. And then Jesus says, you're right in saying I'm a king. But then Pilate tries to provoke Jesus with some questions. He's obviously got some mixed feelings about Jesus. And it turns out at one point he says, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize that I have the power either to free you or to crucify you? So you can imagine all the power of Rome, and Caesar is behind Pilate. And Jesus said, you'd have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. So Pilate's facing a person whom he can sentence to death, but it turns out Jesus isn't afraid of dying. In fact, Jesus intends to die. When Pilate heard Jesus say this, he then turns to the crowd and he says, you can take Jesus, and they say, but if you let this man go, you won't be a friend of Caesar's. So now what's interesting is the religious leaders are putting Pilate in a predicament that they will treat Jesus as though he's a member of those kind of people that create sedition and rebellion against Rome. And if Pilate lets Jesus go, he's actually going to be helping the cause that undermines Rome. So of all things, they appeal to Pilate to let Barabbas go, who's already known as a person who's going to cause trouble. And he already has proven that. But eventually, Pilate will simply say, here's your king. And Jesus will be sentenced. He's the one that's going to be wearing a purple robe, a crown of thorns, the King of the Jews written above his head. When he goes through the streets of Jerusalem, for the most part, people are going to be joining in with the charge that Jesus should be crucified because he hasn't delivered what they expected as a messianic hero, a messianic leader, someone who would deliver them from Rome. Instead, he's going to die in a humiliating and shameful death at the hands of Rome.